All right, everybody, welcome back. Ready to dive in. Today, we're tackling a big one, a real cornerstone of international relations, national interest.
It's one of those terms, you hear it tossed around constantly. But what does it actually mean? And why should we care?
Exactly. And that's what we're here to unpack. We've got some seriously insightful sources lined up, different perspectives on how this idea of national interest shapes the world.
Because it really does, doesn't it? It's the driving force behind so many global events, conflicts, alliances, the whole shebang.
Totally. So let's break it down. What are we talking about when we say national interest? What's the textbook definition? And more importantly, how does it actually play out in the real world?
So at its core, national interest boils down to what a country considers essential for its survival, its prosperity, basically its well-being on the world stage. It's like a country's wish list, but with much higher stakes.
Right. It's not just like, oh, it'd be nice to have a trade deal with this country. It's more like we need to secure our borders or we need to protect our access to vital resources, things like that, right?
Exactly. It's about those fundamental needs and goals that dictate a country's actions on the global stage. Think security, economic stability, even cultural preservation, those big picture items.
Okay, so it's about survival. It's about thriving. It makes sense. But it also sounds like a recipe for conflict. Everyone's got their own interests, their own priorities. How do countries even begin to cooperate when everyone's looking out for number one?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And that's where things get really interesting. Because sometimes pursuing your own national interest means working with other countries, even if they're not your best buddies.
Okay, so give me an example. When has this whole national interest thing actually led to countries coming together?
Well, take the global effort to combat climate change. On the surface, individual countries might prioritize economic growth, even if it means burning more fossil fuels.
Hmm.
But, and this is key, recognizing the shared threat of a changing climate pushes them to cooperate, to find common ground.
Right, because ultimately, a healthy planet, a stable climate, those benefit everyone, even if it requires some compromise and collaboration in the short term.
Precisely. So you see, even in the pursuit of their own interests, countries can find themselves working together towards a common goal. It's not always a zero-sum game.
Okay, so that's the optimistic view, but let's flip the script for a second. Our sources also talk about the potential downsides of national interest. What happens when this drive to protect your own interests goes too far? What are we talking about there?
Well, think about historical trade wars, for example. One country might impose tariffs to protect its own industries, but that often triggers retaliation, harming global trade for everyone. Or think about territorial disputes, where nations dig in their heels, unwilling to compromise, even if it risks escalating into conflict.
Right, so it's like a balancing act, right? Trying to secure your own future while also navigating the needs and interests of other players on the world stage.
Exactly. And that's where the concept of nationalism comes into play. Because a strong sense of national identity can be a powerful force, for good or for ill.
So unpack that for me. How does nationalism factor into all of this?
Well, think about those moments when a nation comes together, like during the Olympics. There's a shared pride, a sense of collective identity. That kind of healthy patriotism can be a powerful unifier, a source of strength and resilience.
Right, but it also feels like there's a flip side to that coin, like with everything else we've been discussing. Where does healthy patriotism cross the line into something more, well, dangerous?
That's the danger of ultranationalism. It's when that love for your country morphs into a belief in its inherent superiority, often justifying actions that harm or exploit other nations. It often carries a sense of grievance, a feeling of being wronged or threatened by others.
It's like that old saying, patriotism is loving your country, nationalism is hating everyone else's.
That's a good way to put it. And unfortunately, history is full of examples where ultranationalism fueled conflict and division. Think about the rhetoric leading up to World War II, the demonization of entire groups of people based on their nationality or ethnicity.
And even today, we see this playing out in various forms: territorial disputes, discriminatory policies, even just the language used to demonize opponents on the international stage.
It's a reminder that national interest, while essential, is a complex and often double-edged sword. It requires careful consideration, a willingness to compromise, and a constant awareness of the broader consequences of our actions.
This is what I find so fascinating about these deep dives. It's like you learn a new language, a new way of decoding the world around you. You start seeing these dynamics everywhere.
Absolutely. And I think that's the key takeaway here, to be an informed and critical thinker. When you hear politicians invoking national interest, Don't just accept it at face value. Ask yourself, whose interest does this truly serve?
Dig deeper. Look beyond the headlines and the sound bites.
Exactly. And remember, every nation, no matter how large or small, acts in what it perceives to be its own best interest. The challenge, and it's a constant one, is to find ways to reconcile those interests peacefully and constructively.
To find those win-win scenarios wherever possible.
Exactly. And to remember that we're all in this together. The decisions one country makes, particularly those driven by national interest, can have ripple effects across the globe. And that, I think, is what makes understanding this concept so crucial.
So, for our listeners who are just starting to wrap their heads around all of this, what's the one thing you want them to remember? What's the most important thing to keep in mind when it comes to national interest?
For me, it's about recognizing that national interest isn't a static concept. It evolves over time, shaped by a complex web of factors, from domestic politics to global events. It's also crucial to remember that it is subjective. It is defined by each individual nation and, by extension, often those in positions of power within those nations.
It's about asking those tough questions, thinking critically, and never underestimating the power of national interest on the world stage. It's messy, it's complicated, and it's constantly evolving.
Which is what makes it so important to understand.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And that, my friends, is the bottom line. We've just scratched the surface here, but hopefully this deep dive has given you some new tools to navigate the complexities of international relations. As always, keep those thinking caps on, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.